Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody. Thank you again for joining me. This is Stefan Orinda from All Source News, and I wanted to jump in here again to kind of cover some latest breaking news that we got this morning of a U.S. Customs and Border Protection drone that was observable flying over areas west of Toluca in the state of Mexico. This was a drone that was tracked on Flight Radar 24. It was first picked up by accounts on Twitter that kind of monitor a lot of flight movements, and they noticed that a U.S. Customs and Border Protection drone was flying in areas west of Mexico State, specifically west of Toluca. For those who are not familiar with the geography of Mexico, there's the country of Mexico, then there's a specific state called the state of Mexico, which obviously also includes Ciudad de Mexico or Mexico City. And so we had a U.S. Customs and Border Protection drone that flew over and was monitoring areas west of Toluca. And I wanted to jump in here because I think people are going to start misconstruing or connecting two things that are not necessarily related. Because one, in my previous video, I kind of talked about the breaking news of Trump authorizing the military to do advanced planning to target Mexican cartels. And a lot of people saw this MQ-9 drone and might have directly associated that earlier reporting with this drone flying over there. And I want to come in here to kind of separate the two. Number one, again, this is a Customs and Border Protection drone. So this is part of the Department of Homeland Security. It's a law enforcement drone. These drones are not armed. They don't have any Hellfire missiles, anything like that. And this drone was very likely conducting ISR over that specific region. And I think most people would directly connect kind of what they were collecting on was either one, probably a high value target. That's my most likely thing that they were targeting. They were probably utilizing it to collect intelligence on a high value target. Or two, maybe on some sort of drug production or drug manufacturing area. But, kind of that area is not really, yeah, there is obviously drugs there and all that. Do not get me wrong, but it's not really the top area in the top list of Mexican drug productions. So I do believe that this falls more within the high value target area that they were probably collecting on someone, not on something. But again, they could have been trying to collect on drug labs that are operating in those areas, as those are very widespread in Mexico. But I still believe that this was an operation targeting a high value target. What made this very newsworthy is the fact that this drone was tracked on flight radar. Now, the interesting thing is, while the drone was flying in west of Toluca, it started to get picked up on Twitter, and then it got picked up by the Mexican press. It looks like the drone stopped emitting over flight radar, right? And so that makes me believe that probably this was a mistake, that they did not want people to know that they have U.S. Customs and Border Protection MQ-9s flying over Mexico, and that they inadvertently left it squawking on so that everybody can track it, and then that was a mistake, that they didn't want that to happen. So again, this was Customs and Border Protection. Before I kind of give you on who I think was being targeted and which cartel is, let me go use directly to the kind of the source of the information and a great account that I regularly interact with that kind of did this. I will easily shorten my thing. I am not a believer of pausing videos. I believe more in just going live. So let's just shorten my image right here. And here you can see directly from the source, right? So a U.S. Customs and Border Protection MQ-9 Guardian, which on flight radar showed itself as a U.S. Air Force, which again, that's a mistake. That was not a U.S. Air Force drone. This was a Customs and Border Protection drone, was flying in areas out west of Toluca. Now, this drone appears to be out of South Angelo, Texas, and it was flying all the way down into Toluca. This is directly it. You're going to see reporting that this was a U.S. Air Force drone. That is not true. This was a Customs and Border Protection drone. I did talk to Johnny Gemini, which is right there, as you can see. He's the one that kind of really laid down this information a lot more extensively for everybody to understand, because it was misidentified on Flight Radar 24 as a U.S. Air Force, and he's the one. So make sure you give him a follow. He's a great account. The other one is obviously, as you can see on the right, 1776 Girl. She's also phenomenal. I interact with both regularly and ensure that a lot of the information, these guys track a lot of military movement aircrafts around the world, but I always go to them for specific information related to Latin America, both Mexican flights, American flights along the border, and kind of ISR collection. And they also do a lot of phenomenal work also tracking deportation flights with other accounts as well. So you make sure you kind of follow them and track them extensively. So this is the information, right? This is what we got. And I wanted to make sure that people do not mistake. You're going to see in the reports that this was a U.S. Air Force drone. That is not true. This was U.S. and Customs and Border Protection. So I'm going to go back to increasing myself, making sure that everything is good. And again, I am not a believer in, as you can see, in very high sophisticated editing. Don't really have the time right now for it anyway, so I just wanted to come here and do it straight. So, again, this wasn't a U.S. Air Force drone. And so that's why I am not associating this reporting that we got, that the video that I got earlier that I made about Trump authorizing military strikes against Mexican cartels with this event. This, as it was U.S. Customs and Border Protection under the Department of Homeland Security, those are two separate issues. And what it does show, though, as another account that I regularly interact with kind of highlighted, it's an account run by three different people. They go by the name of Pernicious Propaganda or Natsek Boogie. He made a great kind of observation with this, highlighting like, look, the fact that this drone is flying overtly over Mexican airspace indicates that there is deep bilateral coordination between the United States and Mexico in this regard, and that the Mexican government clearly was made aware of this and clearly coordinated this type of flight and operations. And so this wasn't something done in the background covertly or to try to undermine Mexican sovereignty. Clearly, this was done in coordination with the Mexican government. And we do know from reporting earlier this year from, for example, CNN, I think was the worst to have the scoop, of CIA MQ-9 drones flying over Mexico at the behest of the Mexican government, at the request of the Mexican government, specifically trying to find these drug labs that are spread across Mexico, and the U.S. collects on them and pass that information to the Mexican government, who then target those specific areas, right? So this Customs and Border Protection drone that was flying over Toluca or near Toluca clearly was doing it in coordination with the Mexican government. This was not covert. This was not unilateral. Something like that doesn't happen. It's specifically if it's emitting over Flight Radar 24, right? But again, I think the mistake is that Customs and Border Protection probably shouldn't have been publicly releasing these videos that like this in Flight Radar. Like that, I think that was a mistake because during the flight when it started to get picked up, they shut down. Basically, I guess it's AIS. Again, I'm not an expert in aviation, and we lost track of it over Flight Radar. And I think that was a mistake that Customs and Border Protection probably didn't want people to know this, or maybe they did, and it was kind of sent a message to the Mexican government saying, "Hey, we want people to know we're here." But I find that hard to believe because they needed the Mexican permission to do this, right? They needed that coordination with Mexican airspace. They needed the deconfliction with Mexican airspace, and probably one of the standards was, okay, just don't emit, and then we'll make sure everything in your airspace is clear. Just don't emit, and then we'll continue to conduct collection. So I think this was CBP that just had terrible OPSEC, just straight up. And it is terrible OPSEC because now everybody that you're collecting in that area knows you're collecting on them and they're going to flee. Or even the manufacturing, or if there's a drug lab specifically that you were focusing on, they're going to know you were collecting on them. They're out of there. Because it's one thing if it's Mexican ISR, it's another thing if American ISR, right? That has a higher priority. That means the US is tracking somebody or something of importance. So everybody in that area is now gone. So Customs and Border Protection really, I think, messed up from an OPSEC point of view and kind of gave away too much detail, and they didn't want to. This flight of a drone, I think a lot of people, what I would say is this is the first time that we publicly know that this happened, right? Again, we did get reporting previously, for example, the CIA drones flying over Mexico, U.S. military ISR passing on information to the Mexican counterparts. A lot of those U.S. military aircrafts generally fly along the border or along international airspace, but some of those obviously get passed on. I think this one from the Customs and Border Protection, I don't think this was the first time it's ever happened. I think this is the first time we know about it never happened. And the reason why I say that is in the past, we've seen images on flight radar showing, Customs and Border Protection aircraft and drones magically appear in the Gulf of Mexico already, 20, 30,000 feet in the air, flying back, returning to base, right? So they're just out of nowhere, boom, they pop up in the Gulf of Mexico and they're returning to base. If you see that, clearly they were conducting ISR, and I think a lot of people might have assumed maybe they're collecting over the Caribbean, maybe they're trying to make sure that the drug traffickers don't know where they're at while they're doing these ISR missions. But this now opens the possibility of thinking, well, maybe what they were actually doing is they were flying over Mexico, right? I think that's something. So this drone that we saw today, this morning in West Toluca, might indicate that this is a standard practice that both the U.S. and Mexicans does, specifically within the Customs and Border Protection, of providing ISR support, but it's just not been publicly, emitted on flight radar and publicly available for obvious reasons. But now that we kind of have the historical context of U.S. Customs and Border Protection drones flying over Gulf of Mexico, just magically appearing, I and a lot of us were kind of talking in the background, assumed that they were doing operations along the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, along the Caribbean, trying to track drug trafficking routes, etc. This might now open the possibility that maybe no, they were actually coming out of Mexico, and that they were doing ISR inside of Mexico, and then when they reached the Gulf of America or Gulf of Mexico, they turn back their squawk, and then they're heading back to base to kind of give that plausible deniability, or more importantly, as I said, highlighted earlier, that OPSEC that clearly in this case doesn't happen. So this does look like it might have been a more robust program. This is something that might have happened more regularly. I think CBP completely messed up. But again, since it was CBP, this shouldn't be tied into my earlier video that I made about Trump authorizing advanced planning to conduct military strikes against Mexican cartels. Because if you're going to do that, one, you're not going to emit your drones over airspace, right? Because that means the military operation is going to be unilateral. You're not going to emit your drones over flight radar in this context. Two, you would be looking more at military aircraft. And three, they would be operating covertly, without the knowledge of the Mexican government, not publicly available, right? I mean, look, when President Trump authorized the strike on the Iranian nuclear program, everybody, they convinced the world that the B-2 bombers were flying to Guam, and in reality, they went all the way east and bombed the nuclear facilities there, right? So the fact that this was a CBP drone, not an Air Force drone, does tell me that this was not tied into that specific planning, that this was not connected to that type of operations, that this was a law enforcement component, and as law enforcement really wouldn't lead a unilateral military operations in Mexico, this type of law enforcement aircraft would probably be passing information directly to the Mexicans and passing them intelligence more on that area rather than trying to plan, unilateral military strikes for the United States. We would see other assets being employed, and to be honest, we wouldn't even see it; it would just happen. So again, since this was CBP, I don't want people to mistake that with my previous video of Trump authorizing military planning. But to the heart of the matter, who do I think, they were kind of observing or what? Look, it's really hard to tell, based on the limited amount of information. We just know where the drone was kind of flying around and doing ISR. What I can tell you is that specific area west of Toluca, we do know is a very strong territorial control of La Nueva Familia Michoacana, specifically under Pez y Fresa, who are sanctioned by the United States. And La Nueva Familia Michoacana is a designated foreign terrorist organization by the Trump administration earlier this year. So Toluca is really much under the control of La Nueva Familia Michoacana, and so that clearly means that's where this ISR, at least the target of a cartel, if there's a cartel angle to this, which more than likely, the territorial control falls within La Nueva Familia Michoacana, so that kind of leads credence to believe that's who they were targeting. Again, we have no way of actually confirming it. There's always a possibility there was other players involved, there's other people involved, other cartel members involved, other criminal enterprises involved. It could literally be anybody. But with kind of the few little information that we have based on the drone and the area, the cartel that controls that is La Nueva Familia Michoacana, led by El Pez y Fresa, who again are sanctioned and are foreign terrorist organizations. So, who specifically or what? I mean, again, drug laboratories have always been a huge focus of U.S. intelligence collections to pass on to the Mexicans for them to target. So we could be looking at drug collection. And then if it's an individual, which I believe more this falls within the category of a high-value target as in an individual, it could be anybody within the leadership of La Nueva Familia Michoacana. I mean, obviously, the big people to be looking at would be Pez y Fresa, which if it were them, CBP just blew it with with terrible OPSEC, because now if those were the target, they're long gone and they're going away somewhere else. But it's hard to tell. It's just, I think that if you look at kind of when I've done my territorial control maps and analyze it, we do know that that's La Nueva Familia Michoacana's territory. And so that kind of by association makes it more likely to them, but that's not a definitive answer. It could have been anybody or anything or any cartel. Just that area we know is very much deep in La Nueva Familia Michoacana. And we do know that La Nueva Familia Michoacana is battling along that area around that region against the Jalisco New Generation cartel, right? They do have battles in that area, but that specific route that they took and kind of were circling around, that without a doubt, with no dispute, no matter what, that's La Nueva Familia Michoacana. CG&G is not there yet. They are battling the CG&G. The other group kind of nearby also to look at is Guerreros Unidos. That's another cartel, a very smaller group that also operates there, but they're not really near there. That's more in the heartland of historical territory for the La Nueva Familia Michoacana. So, again, we don't know exactly. This has all just happened this morning, but I think for you to kind of close this episode out, just to make sure you understand, is I would not associate this with Trump's threat of unilateral military operations. I think these are two separate things. Again, CBP is the one who led it. I think CBP had terrible OPSEC. It does indicate that I believe that this was a much deeper run program that CBP used to do and have their MQ-9s fly over Mexico, because we've seen MQ-9s magically appear in the Gulf of Mexico historically in the past. So that kind of indicates that this is something much more seated and likely done for counter cartel purposes. And based on the territorial control, the most likely suspect would then be La Nueva Familia Michoacana. And if it's somebody key there, the highest figures to collect on is Fresa y Pez, but we really don't know. So quick video, just wanted to give you kind of my quick analysis on that. Again, no editing. I'm just going to upload this as is. Please let me know what you think. I'm sorry again for kind of the different background, but I'm excited to show you my new background when I'm done with my vacations and get back to it. So I appreciate your time. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.